An hour and a half later, Vagabond lay at anchor, Lucy May still tied to her port side. After the initial exhilaration and relief of being reunited, those on board were in various states of disorientation and exhaustion. Jean, Jim and Lisa had all been hurt resisting the taking of Vagabond, and Neil during its rescue. Jim had bruised ribs, a bloody nose, cut and sore wrists where they had bound him. Jean's left cheek had a swollen and bluish bruise where Macklin had hit her when she tried to help Jim. When Lisa had begun pounding on Macklin's back, Jerry had struck her on the side of the head with the butt of his gun. Neil had a 2-inch long, 1/2-inch wide wood sliver lodged in his left arm. Comrade Macklin had examined Lisa's head right after her injury in a game when Vagabond had been sailing away, and had told Jean that Lisa probably had a minor concussion but no fracture. He offered now to pull out the splinters from Neil's arm, but after first refusing, Neil soon concluded that Jean and Frank were being too gentle in their probing. He finally let Macklin coolly butcher the splinters out. Later, after tying Macklin's hands behind him and then to the mizzenmast, and leaving Jim on guard, they buried Jerry at sea. Jean came up on deck and saw Neil, Frank and Ollie standing in the dim light of the wheelhouse with Neil reading in a low voice from the Bible. She stood momentarily mesmerised by the weird scene, which continued as Neil stopped reading and he and Ollie lifted the body up and slid it overboard. The whole experience was so unreal, so disconnected from her previous life, that she staggered down the steps to the main cabin for the reassuring sight of pots, pans, a kitchen. Anything to ease the eeriness of those 3 dim figures in the cockpit, like warlocks chanting some incantation and then throwing a body into the sea. She prepared coffee, not because anyone had asked her to, but to ground herself, to re-establish everyday reality. When Frank came down, he looked anxiously at Jean and came over to take her in his arms again. His white sports shirt was sweat-stained and grimy, his grey hair slick with sweat. He had embraced her after the initial rescue, and she had clung to him as a brother or a father, a haven from the insane chaos that was raining down upon her. "Coffee or scotch?" Jean now asked Frank. Captain Ollie was already sipping at a cupful of scotch, caffeine being bad for the teeth. "Both," Frank replied, and sat down with a great sigh on the settee opposite Ollie, who had slumped over sideways and was soon snoring. When Neil appeared, he paused with uncharacteristic uncertainty at the foot of the steps. He accepted a cup of coffee from Jean with a mechanical smile, his severe face showing none of the warm attentiveness that it had so often throughout the day. "We should be getting underway," Neil said to Frank, who was sitting with his back to him. Frank stared into the bronze glow of his whiskey, and a single swallow tossed it off. When Frank didn't reply, Jean asked, "Where are we going?" "It's my judgment we should sail out of the bay to the ocean," Neil replied, looking at Frank's back. Frank turned on the transistor radio on the shelf above the dinette table, and after a moment located a working station. As they all began listening to a radio report of the events of the day, Jean exchanged a strangely conspiratorial glance with Neil and then sat down beside Frank, instinctively placing her hand on top of his. The nuclear war was exactly 1 day old, and already, although someone claimed both sides were showing restraint, every European country and most parts of the United States had been hit. The US retaliation against the Soviet Union was described as if it were even more devastating than the blows the US had received. A statement by the President indicated that the war had been fought to the bitter end, no matter what the consequences. The President had said that he expected every citizen to do all he could to support the American effort to punish the Soviet Union for its unprovoked criminal aggression. A state of martial law had been declared. Finally, Frank reached over and turned off the radio. "I couldn't get to Norway," he said to no one in particular. "No planes available?" Neil asked. "Nothing to pay with," Frank replied. "I have no money." In the silence that followed, Jean became aware of Neil's unanswered call to get going hovering over the room. "What are we going to do now?" she asked Frank gently. "I don't know," Frank answered. "Macklin got hold of a puller," Neil said, "and they loosened the old shaft. Jim and I should be able to put in the new one and get the prop on in less than an hour. Then we should sail south." Frank turned in his settee seat to look past Jean at Neil, who was still standing at the foot of the companionway steps. "What about Bob?" he asked. "What about Captain Ollie? What about the rest of the country?" It seemed strange to Jean to hear someone asking about Bob. It was like an inquiry into another lifetime. "Bob is dead," she said automatically. "The radioactive cloud bank from Washington is still spreading," Neil went on. "The fallout from everywhere will get worse. I doubt we can survive unless we get east and south fast." Seeing Frank's haggard face, Jean realised with a shudder that he was in a state of shock. He was barely there. She saw a vague flash of irritation cross his face when Neil spoke, but no comprehension. Then, "We should get underway," she said softly, and stood up. Looking back at Frank, she saw him turning to pour himself another small glass of whiskey. "We've got new food supplies in Ollie's smack," Neil said to her. "I'd like you and Ollie to transfer them to Vagabond, and then you can begin storing them." "All right," she answered, aware of how gently Neil was speaking to her. "We're running away?" Frank announced in a low, husky voice. "I hope so," Neil snapped back. "What else can we do?" Jean asked quickly. Frank tossed off his second drink, slid himself sideways and stood up. "When I know, we'll do it," he said. "Hey, you!" he shouted at the sleeping fisherman, who awoke, startled and blinking. "You want to join us on an ocean cruise?" Captain Ollie squinted dazedly at Frank. "I got a son I want to see," replied Ollie, frowning. "Well then, you have to shove off," Frank said. "We're only taking cowards and deserters." He brushed past Jean and Neil and up the companionway. Neil and Ollie followed. "What are we going to do with this load of filth?" Frank asked, stopping to stare at Conrad Macklin, who was sitting at the foot of the mizzenmast with his arms tied behind his back. Jim was on a settee seat guarding him, a bandaged forehead and bluish bruise on his lower ribcage indicating his wounds. "I'm sorry we stole your boat," Macklin said unexpectedly. "I say we dump him overboard," Frank went on fiercely, turning to Neil. "I tried to get through to the Coast Guard to come and arrest him, but the man on duty said we'd have to bring him in." "To where?" Neil asked. "They're stationed at Crisfield. We're not wasting time going back there. Throw him overboard." A silence followed. Macklin looked expressionlessly at Frank. When Jean came up into the wheelhouse, he turned to her. "I'm sorry about your girl," he said. "Jerry didn't mean to hurt her. She'll be all right, though." "Shut up!" Frank shouted, taking a step towards Macklin and flushing with anger. "Ignore him, Frank," Neil said. "Jim, get into your scuba gear. We're going to put on that new propeller shaft." While Jim went forward to change, Jean and Ollie began transferring the food from Lucy May. Frank sat down and put his face in his hands. Neil stayed where he was, facing Macklin. "I panicked," Macklin went on quietly, his eyes as expressionless as always. "Jerry was convinced that without food you were going to kick us off the boat before we cleared the cheapspate. When I got back with that pulley, he'd already taken over the boat without me. Ask Jim." He looked up at Neil with an anguished expression that Neil couldn't quite believe was genuine. "Take me with you. I can help." Frank erupted from his seat and grabbed Macklin by the throat, sending his head crashing back against the mizzenmast. "Shut up, you stupid bastard!" he shouted. "You say another word and I'll kill you." Neil pulled Frank away. "Help Ollie and Jean," he said to him quietly. For a moment Frank stood looming over Macklin. Neil could feel him trembling. "I can't stand that kind of talk," Frank said, finally moving away. "A man steals my boat, hits a woman in the face, has his crony almost kill Lisa, and he expects us to forgive him." As he led his friend over towards Lucy May, Neil could not respond. It was disturbing to remember that he himself had been perfectly ready to steal a boat to go chase after Vagabond. And he would have let Macklin and Jerry stay if he hadn't cleaned out that supermarket. Now, left alone with Macklin, Neil knelt down to loosen the large removable section of decking that covered the engine. He took a flashlight out of the tool chest lying on the shelf above the engine to examine the position of the bent shaft. "You need me, Captain Loken," Macklin suddenly said to him in a whisper. "You need my medical skills. You need someone else aboard who's got your cold will to survive. You can use me." Neil pushed himself back into a kneeling position to look at Macklin in the dim light. Macklin was staring at him serenely. "The others have too much heart to survive in this world," Macklin went on. "You can use me. You know it. I didn't want to take this boat. I can't sail. Without Jerry, I'm not about to turn pirate again." Neil looked back at him expressionlessly. "Despite your cold will to survive," he said, "the helpless people with too much heart have tied you to a mast and are getting ready to throw you overboard." Jean and Frank came into the wheelhouse carrying bags of groceries and disappeared into the main cabin. "You know Frank won't kill me," Macklin whispered. "That woman wouldn't let him. Only you are strong enough and cold enough to kill me. But you need another man like me. You need a doctor. You know it." With you around, we'll damn well need someone's medical skills, Neil said. When Jim came into the wheelhouse dressed in his wetsuit, Neil stood up. If Frank agrees, we're dumping you ashore at the first opportunity, he said aloud to Macklin. I'm a fighter, Loken, Macklin said in normal voice. You need another fighter. I can use your .45, Neil replied, nodding to Jim to pick up the new shaft. The rest of you? No. Let's get to it, Jim.